pleasure to be here. And it's my pleasure to introduce everyone to a very exciting fiction debut from a very, very creative and original writer, playwright, Nandita Dinesh, who's joining us from San Francisco, where she lives. It's the early hours of the morning, so I thank her very, very much for getting up and taking part in this. It's very, very exciting. I want to just continue Amelia's description. It's of the novel. It's a bold and ambitious work of political fiction that examines the emotional and psychological impact of occupation and colonization. It takes place in a nameless country where our two protagonists, a young man and a young woman from the opposite sides of the conflict, find themselves in curfew together, just as the occupying power, or the long-standing occupying power, has formally annexed the territory. So Nandita, why don't you take over from here? Tell us about this nameless country, which is called This Place, and the two people who find themselves under curfew together. Who are they exactly? How do they know each other? How are they together in this space? So over to you.
Thank you, Carl. Right, so these two characters, without giving too much away, have met when this outsider, the young woman from that place, comes to this place on some kind of journey. We begin to unravel slowly the intentions behind her own presence in this place. But it's that point of contact in this place with her being the outsider representative of an occupying nation state that forms the core of their budding relationship. And what I really admire about both these characters is their passion for changing the world in whatever way, and this delicate balance that they constantly struggle with between absolute fatalism and knowing that things are not going to change, and everything's basically just going to go to shit, if I'm allowed to swear in this forum, to maintaining this deep faith in the possibility of what they can do with their respective passions. So she is someone who works in the larger realm of deprogramming, and I'll leave it there so that folks can figure out from the book who she's trying to deprogram. And the young man works in a realm that's called protest design, which is clearly not a quote unquote job in this world. But in that world, it is a career that people can pursue. And so it's these particular areas that they are passionate about that bind them together. And I think that's where, that's the essential, that's the crux of the novel.
They do have very interesting professions. I know you don't want to reveal too much about deprogramming and protest design, but I'm curious, I'm sure this is not just a figment of your imagination. You have a very fertile imagination, but I'm just curious, there's wonderful moments when he tells her about his experience studying for his degree or his MA in protest design or whatever. Does that have any root in reality, or is it, is it purely, your own creation?
It depends on the day you ask me, right? Today, I think it has a root in reality. So I think a lot of it draws from my own work as a community theater practitioner in conflict and post-conflict zones. So over the last 15 years or so, my work has taken me through a varied number of contexts, and we can discuss them in more detail if you'd like. And in these spaces, the notions of deprogramming and protest design have been talked about in different ways, never as careers, but how both of these concepts are really integral to considering how, if in any way, conflicts might be brought to an end, right? So how do we unschool ourselves from seeing particular types of binaries? How do we stage our protests in ways that garner the kind of attention we want rather than state violence? And so it's, in a way, they're very much rooted in reality. I think part of it also is a nod to my training in performance studies, where we study everything as performance. So a protest is a performance, your everyday life is a performance. And if you start seeing everything as a performance, then it's not too far of a reach to then take it to the next level and think of crafting these different types of vocations, you know?
No, that I thought it was extremely novel and creative the way that you sketch the characters' background through through their expertise or what have you. It was also interesting about the whole question of deprogramming too, because I think often when we discuss deprogram, we're often talking about deprogramming people who've been in cults or what have you.
Yeah.
And it was interesting the fact that deprogramming, involving militaries and stuff like that, that just seemed really like, I hadn't thought about it, but I thought it's quite obvious actually, and it's really is, it's completely logical. Now, one of the things that I really, really enjoy about the novel is how it sort of takes place in time. It's like the clock is ticking. We have, each chapter is headed by a sort of time of day or what have you. And the interesting things about how you portray curfew, it must have been a challenge when you were imagining this book initially, but the interesting thing is that there's a lot of downtime during curfew.
Yeah.
And part of the challenge of being able to resist curfew is how you creatively use that downtime. And there's these like wonderful games and exchanges in the novel where you have characters who obviously he comes from a family who's been living under occupation for, it seems, several decades, multi-generational experience of occupation and what have you. And the family has evolved all these methods of working out how to pass the time, games, strategies. And to be honest, I've read, several books about occupation, but I never imagined like occupation in the sort of everyday, how you experience occupation in an everyday way. So I'd love you to tell us about these games and these strategies, and just, are they based on your own experience of working in conflict zones, or it's just really, really one of the sort of things that I found enormously entertaining about this novel.
Yeah, I think it stems from being an outsider in conflict zones specifically. So that there's two particular contexts that I drew a lot for this from. One was from being a visitor to IDP camps in northern Uganda, so internally displaced persons camps, and sort of noticing the weight of time, if you will, because there aren't too many operational schools for the kids. There aren't too many jobs to be had. And then the question for me became, as a visitor who was entering this space where people were speaking with me, was to say, well, what do you do every day? Right? So what do you do when you wake up? What do you do to pass the time before you go to bed again, when there is almost literally nothing to do because you're in that situation of displacement? So that was one of the roots, and that was one of my very first experiences in an active conflict zone. And then, you have the other end of it, which is my work in Kashmir. And one of the years that I happened to be there, my colleagues have always talked about curfews in Kashmir. It's sort of it's part of everyday life. But in 2016, when I was there was a particular incident that happened where I got caught in the middle of a curfew myself. And it was then that it harkened back to the questions that had arisen for me in places like northern Uganda, because I was sitting there and I was trying to figure out what to do to pass the time, and I didn't know. And so there was no internet connection because it had been shut down. Electricity was, you couldn't always depend on it, so laptops couldn't be fully charged all the time. Cable TV stations would work at some times, but not other times. And so it became this real exercise for me of counting the hours and saying, okay, this is how I'm going to do it so that I can keep my sanity in that moment. So it draws very much from that the positioning of an outsider, right? And what I envision it must. I mean, I can't even envision what it must be like, but an exercise in my imagination of what it could be like to live that reality on a daily basis.
Could you be a little bit more specific about some of the things, like there's the glaze?
Yeah, so there's a few different things, right? So there's the glaze, which is, I suppose, a bizarre form of meditation, if one can call it that, or a more colloquial term would be a formalized approach to spacing out.
Right.
So how do you how do you essentially detach from what's happening, and if anyone here practices any form of yoga, this is a constant thing. You focus on certain things and you try to dissipate other things from your consciousness. There's something called, what is it? The gaze, where he spends time watching movies. And so that's something I've certainly witnessed, where friends of mine would have hard drives that were full of pirated movies that they've collected in the hundreds precisely for this reason, right? So if there's a curfew, you could literally watch movies all the time. And assuming you have enough electricity to charge your laptop, you're good to go. That's the way to keep yourself occupied. There's the glow, which is smoking cigarettes, and then also rationing them out, because you can't go out too much in a curfew. So you can only allow yourself a certain amount of cigarettes every hour. Um, there's a glorification, isn't there? So that's the one where sort of indulges in his fantasies and his sexual fantasies, and tries to escape into the world of the erotic, if I can be really euphemistic about the whole thing. And so there's definitely that component to keeping yourself entertained. There's the gallivant, which is where you step outside and walk around during the points in curfew where you're allowed to go out. And you make very, very conscious choices about how you map where you go and what you do. So again, some of these were based on observation. Some of them, like the glorification, clearly none of my colleagues really spelled that out for me, but that was something I imagined would occur fairly often. So that's sort of the range of it.
Yeah. One of the other things I really, really, one of the things about the novel, I mean, there's so many, it's such a deep novel. There's so many entry points into the novel, so many things we could discuss. But two of the key things is that the setting of the novel involves a wedding. And that brings, it's his older brother getting married. I don't know whether his older brother is getting married. And obviously a marriage in this country that you've created involves a lot of preparation, a lot of ritual, all that kind of stuff. And then it's not simply a fact that they're just going to turn up in a registry office and get married or whatever, and that's it. It's something that involves days of preparation and interfamilial interactions or whatever. And it's interesting to see like the tension between the announcement of an annexation, states annexations of another country, and how it ripples down into a wedding. It's a really, really great way to sort of dramatize the power of an occupation or a sudden announcement. Okay, this is now being formalized into an annexation. You are now part of us, etc., etc., and how that just affects, something as weddings aren't necessarily mundane, but they are. It's like weddings take place every day. People go to hospital every day. People have to go out and get money out of the bank every day. And all those things are changed. So I'd just be curious. I mean, the wedding situation is just, beautifully realized. It's a point of tension in some ways, because there's obviously some hope that will they be able to have the wedding, or won't they be able to have it? It's one of the will they won't. I mean, there's lots of will they won't they's in this novel, but that's one in particular one. I just thought be curious if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Of course, it's a great question. It came about with the culmination of the theater project that I was working on in Kashmir. So there was a group of us. We worked together for about 8 years, on and off, creating an immersive theater performance that was 24 hours long. So the audience members had to come and live in our theatrical Kashmir for 24 hours. And the audience were intended to be outsiders. So people like me who are very privileged outsiders from the Indian subcontinent who grew up in other parts of the region, knowing very little about what reality is like for Kashmiris. So that was sort of the premise of the piece. And then there became a question, right? How do you how do you have a group of spectators with you for 24 hours? And what is a frame that can hold that isn't constantly going at them with the trauma, because the trauma is very real, but it's simplistic to negate the joy that also exists in many of these places, the joy and the resilience and the hope and the community. And so that, the actors and I, it was very much a team decision. And we sat down and we said, what are we going to do? I mean, how do we keep them from flipping out in hour 12? And one of the actors, it was his suggestion that in the play, we put in a wedding. And he said, look, weddings are things that we do under curfew, which I hadn't thought about until that point. And they are celebratory. They involve food, so we can feed the audience. We can sing songs with them. We can actually teach them something about Kashmiri rituals because they would not be from Kashmir and wouldn't know what our weddings look like. So there's all of these cultural education components that could happen in the frame of a wedding that would allow us to pass time and immerse the audience with the understanding that the wedding is happening under curfew. And while we were in one of our performances, there was a young man who was a student from a different part of India than myself. He's from the western part. And he came to the performance, and at the end of it, he came to one of the actors and he said, "This can't be real. I mean, a wedding under curfew? I mean, this can't happen, right?" And I remember this so clearly because one of my colleagues turned to him and said, if we didn't have weddings during curfew, no one would ever get married. And I could just see this young man's jaw drop. He'd never thought about it, right? So it was even in that moment, in that performance, for him, curfews were things that was somehow one-offs. It wasn't like an everyday potential reality. And so for him, it was like, well, this is clearly a dramatic frame.
Right, right.
This is not real. And so hearing my colleague tell him that there would be much fewer weddings if there were never ceremonies under curfew, I think just took his breath away.
Wow.
And looking at his reaction, I think that's where the seeds were sown. So this was about, I think, 2 years before I started writing the novel. But that's where the seeds were sown of, okay, we never think about these celebratory
Yeah.
occasions under occupation, and how does that unravel in the context of a
Yeah.
novel?
No, it's so well done. It's really, really, it's really, really well done. I think one of the other things that I'd like to talk about a little bit, it's also a very, very important thing in this novel, is the relationship between the young man and the young woman. And it's a relationship with both strong undercurrents of sexual tension, but there's other tension too. The tension is like, she's from the occupying country, he's from the occupied country. His family have been, in one way or the other, resisting occupation for sort of, it feels like a couple of 2 or 3 generations at least. She's a very, progressive, radical young woman, yet she's, navigating a territory where she's, many of the other people from her country are occupying soldiers. So what the novel really teases through the dilemmas of not only, the sexual dimensions, and there's a very powerful, there's a very powerful moment in the novel when the author, the protagonists have to decide whether or not a relationship will be pursued, an emotional relationship, a romantic relationship will be pursued. It's a very, very powerful part of the novel, and the readers are welcome to read the novel and discover what happens. But the other thing that I'd like to sort of is the sort of question of, power relationships, which you really do like, dive into in many ways. I'm just curious, just if you can talk about the sort of the power dynamics of the relationship between the young man and the young woman.
Of course. I think I wasn't quite aware of what that looked like. So I grew up in a very homogenous environment, or in southern India, where most people around me looked like me. They sort of walked the same walked in the same circles, if you will. So difference in that way was not something I was consciously aware of. So, but however, now if I look back on it, I could probably point out various ways in which power manifested even then, but I couldn't. The first time I became aware of it, and truly sort of in a visceral sense, was in Rwanda, which is one of the first places that I worked in after graduate school. And I had worked there for about on and off for a year and a half. Thought I had developed wonderful relationships with people where I was no longer the obvious outsider, where I was in some way somewhere between, right? So I was somewhere between insider and outsider, and there was an intimacy there between me and my colleagues. And we organized this theater festival. And one particular choice that we made in a play in one of our locations of having the performance became hugely controversial. And the audience members came to the Rwandese actors at the end of the play, and I don't speak Kinyarwanda, so all of this is being translated to me. So there's another power dynamic there, right? So I'm helping coordinate an event, and I don't really understand the nuances of the language of what I'm doing. And it became a very explosive discussion between the actors, because what the audience members had told them essentially was that choice we had made could potentially land us in trouble with the government if we continued performing. And so there was this heated discussion going on, and I was much younger then, and perhaps a little bit naively idealistic, and told my Rwandese co-director of the thing, we should just stick to our choices. And we should, theater is the revolution, all of that stuff. And it was a very simple exchange when she looked at me and she said, "You get to leave. We have to stay. So no, we can't just go on and do it and believe that theater will be the revolution, because we have to face the consequences." And I think for me, that was one of the first moments I clearly remember in my career of being this outsider artist who goes into conflict and post-conflict zones, of recognizing that however long I stayed, however long I worked, however hard I worked, I always had that privilege of leaving. And I think that's something that then began to become a shadow and a thread through my work everywhere, wherever I went after Rwanda. And so the only ethical way in which I knew to write this book, having been someone who's experienced occupation as somewhat a voyeur, was to make that conundrum central.
Yeah, you do
To
it so
say
well.
that the outsider is always the outsider, and you can
Yeah,
try as much as you like, but there is no romantic illusion of you suddenly becoming one of the people, because you can always leave.
yes. No, that's something you deal with very, very powerfully, poignantly too. Just want a question about why the form of the novel? You've been trained and experienced in, you've been an actor, a director, a writer, you've been involved in community theater and, all over the world in very difficult places. What's made you turn to the form of the novel? I'm glad you did, but I mean, I'm just curious.
The simple answer, the hope of having more readers. So I've been working in academic writing for a long time. And even within academic writing, my question always was, how do I make academic writing more accessible? So if you look at some of my past books, they are academic, but I've always used the methodological framework of performative writing to frame why I write the way I write. And it's always been, there'll be one chapter that's, conventionally academic, and the rest of it sort of blows up because I'm trying something different. And I realized that academic writing appeals to or is accessed by a very small market, even if it is experimental. The cost, I think, becomes prohibitive to many folks. There is a certain even perception of what academic writing means and who it's for. That, I wanted to share my writing with people and talk about ideas and talk about what these ideas meant in the world. And I realized that there were very few people I could do that with, because these books were being read by very few people,
Right, right,
only
right.
in drama departments and theater trusts. And that's hence the novel. And so I asked myself, so if I wanted to reach more people, I have to think of a different genre that allows me to do that and to tell these stories on a larger platform or a different platform, that doesn't have the same challenges. Hence this decision to take the step and see if this actually paid off in that way, to facilitate those larger conversations that I'd like to participate in.
Can you tell us a little bit about one of the, I think Amelia gestured towards it, and people who are can access this, but you have some very interesting use of typography, particularly between your two protagonists. Sometimes, the type. Just tell us a little bit about, the sliding typography between our two
Yeah,
protagonists or what have you, because it's a very effective way of revealing moods
yeah.
and distances and that kind of thing. I'd just love to know a little bit more about that.
Of course. In all of my writing, I've always been preoccupied with this idea of how form and content work together. And it has seemed to me, and I don't mean this as a pejorative, but a bit limiting that so many books look the same on the page, even though they tell vastly different stories,
Mm.
obviously. So as a personal challenge, one of the questions I ask myself when writing is, how should it be written? Not only in terms of genre, but how does it look on
Yeah,
the page? And when talking about occupation, it seemed only natural then that there would be two sides, because there are very obviously two sides in this
yeah,
particular tale. I will say though that the earlier drafts were far more ambitious in terms of what they tried to do. So there was like lines in the middle and far more polarizing views of the text. And luckily, I have a lovely agent who talked me down and said, let's try a more nuanced, layered approach, rather than being so obvious with it. And I think the work has benefited a lot in its iterations after that. And so the shifting of the moods rather than being constantly polarized was something that happened in later iterations, once I had more eyes on the text.
right. Oh, it's just a really, really just adds another dimension to what is already a deeply multi-dimensional novel, which I'm really hoping it's going to generate, debate and discussion, both political and aesthetic discussion, you know, everywhere.
Yeah,
It's a novel which is the interesting thing is that when we talk about occupation, colonization, the terms always feel very, very abstract. But what I like about
yeah,
your novel is that it's the intimacy, it's the drama between a couple and a family in a certain place. It really dramatizes the sort of those big, almost monolithic issues of occupation, colonialism, power in a very that there are. I'm not going to spoil anything, but there are sort of some emotional moments in this novel where it's almost you feel like something's been detonated. It's
mm,
just like it's like these incredible shifts of like understanding and perception because of all taking place in a house, in a unnamed country, involving very few people. But what you manage to generate from this situation is very, very very, very powerful. And I think readers are going to be really, really sort of excited by the book. Now, I feel like we could talk about this novel forever. Sadly, we don't have forever. But I wanted to see whether, whether there are other questions. Amelia, are there?
No new questions that you ended up addressing everything through the conversation.
Fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. Anyway, look, Nandita, very exciting to talk to you. I
thank
think
you, Carl. I appreciate it.
yeah, I hope this, I'm looking forward to hearing you discuss this with many other people over the days and months and years ahead. This is a very rich, exciting book. this place, that place, coming to a bookstore near you, I think in June, right?
Yes.
Anyway, if there's no other questions or whatever, I think we'll leave it there.